All right, raw golden, it's all yours, Joe.
All right, well, I have lost my bar now. This is just the way it works, I guess. Um, so you're hearing me, right?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, and I've got on my other screen, I've got my slideshow ready to go, and I lost my bar to share that. And I see all
Because
of you guys.
yeah, we can see your slides. It's just not in presentation mode.
Oh, okay, good. Well, that's all that matters to me then. All right,
Yep, we can see it.
perfect. Kind of a slow start, sorry, guys. All right, are we set?
Awesome.
All right. Well, listen, thanks so much, Jeff, for inviting me. This has been, I don't know, quite a while since I joined in on a FREP meeting. Many years it feels like, and so I'm glad to see some folks of my tenure are still around, and then some new folks with our soil and water districts that have joined in too. So we're going to talk about our version or the kind of the tack we take on regenerative ag or sustainable agriculture. We call, or the area that we work in that's very similar is conservation cropping systems. So cropping systems, we've taken this from Indiana. They probably started 2, 3, 4 years before we did in Illinois. And we really started this emphasis in about 2012. And so the things that we're looking at is the very practical aspects of how can we improve soils and improve water quality with the things that are going on in Illinois. So somewhere out of something like 23 million acres of cropland, for the vast majority across Illinois, it's in corn and soybeans. And so we're looking at 3 different types of practices that we can combine into a system that gives us a ton of benefits. And we're going to talk about the different aspects and how they play into that. And certainly all of these, I think, would play a huge role into regenerative ag. The one thing we don't have, or we don't do much of, is, except for some promotion, would be the livestock component built into regenerative ag. So ours is kind of working with what I see out my window today, a cornfield, chisel plowed cornfield to the south, and a untouched harvested bean field to my right side. And so on the slide here, you can see our focus is conservation tillage, and really to do this in a real fashion, we're really talking about no-till, cover crops, and then nutrient management. And obviously 2 of those are very visual, and one of them is unseen. And it just makes this kind of intriguing as we work into this and we get to the couple of slides on the nutrient loss reduction strategy. But the type of work, basic soil conservation, very visual. You know, we can drive up and down the roads today and have some kind of a concept of how we're doing in areas, even at this time of the year. Down in the left corner, you see kind of the 3 legs of the 3-legged stool for soil health, and that's keeping the soil surface covered. So out here to my right, it's beautiful. It's a soybean stubble and leftover corn residue from the year before. You know, straight ahead, it's probably 50% of the soil's covered. Do not disturb. Field on the right's not been worked at all. The one south of me's had a big ripper go through that's probably worked at 9 inches deep. And then keeping living plants throughout the year. Both the fields out my window, there's nothing living there. And unless there's a few winter annual weeds that come in, there won't be any plants in those fields now until probably actively growing until May. And so even just sort of in the environment that I live in, these are pretty high hurdles still to try to impress upon producers to improve their soils through these kinds of practices. On the next slide here, so we're going to start with some measurement tools, and I think I've got, at least the last time I looked, Elise Olson from Kendall and Jen Schroeder from Cane DuPage. I'm not sure, Patrick, if you've joined on, but we've got Soil and Water District employees that are part of the FREP and have been for all these years. And they're really the ones responsible for conducting the surveys across Illinois. So our local soil and water districts, our Bureau of Land and Water Resources, I think, is somewhere between 8 and 9 people. Because some serve in other roles, and we're non-regulatory. And so most of our work is really conveyed out through our partners. By far our largest partner, of course, is our local soil and water districts. So a soil conservation transect survey is just a survey every year or 2 where we go out and try to get some kind of an idea of what's taking place on the landscape as it relates to those those items we talked about, with the exception of nutrient management. We're not able to collect anything, obviously, on nutrients. On the next slide here are methods. So the staff conduct their windshield surveys. So it's crews of 2 or 3 people in a vehicle. This is a really large survey, statewide over, I think it's done in 99 or 100 of the counties. We have over 51,000 points that we're collecting the data and looking at the tillage, cover crops, and other factors that relate into soil conservation. What's interesting, these are the same points. The survey began in 1994, and we used the same survey points that we did then. And when we move along here a little, in another slide or two, I'll show you why that is. So this isn't random. Every once in a while, somebody will say a little something about the survey because these aren't random locations. These are very much in a transect form and located at the same place. And depending on the size of your county, as an example, Kendall County, each one of their points would be on half-mile intervals along the roadway, along the route. Larger counties would be a mile, and McLean County has 750,000 acres of cropland, so McLean County's on 1.5 mile spacing for their points. We try to come up with between 400 and 500. We might have a few counties that have 600 points. They have to have a driving length of at least 100 miles. And I think I can guarantee that McLean County's got far more than 100 miles that they travel. Again, these are county-based, and in fact, the results are produced by county and then turned into statewide reports. But since we've digitized all of our points, it's also available by watershed. And we do have separate, in some watersheds, we do have, like in McLean County, Lake Bloomington watershed, they run a separate survey with a higher concentration of points to come up with some accuracy to measure for their watershed. I'll show a couple of slides here, but the way we collect them, we use the points that are in the county surveys, then have them located by watershed and can produce at least some information on how we're doing, probably by river basin. So these surveys are conducted shortly after crop emergence, can be tricky on the year. So the corn has to be up, the soybeans have to be planted and up or assumed to be soybeans, which is somewhere in the northern part of the state, right around June 1st, give or take a week, depending on how crop planting is going. And so it includes identifiable cover crops. And so cover crops are tricky with this. If it's cereal rye, and especially that's been let grow taller before it's been killed, that's obvious in a field, and especially in a no-till field. Winter kill cover crops such as oats and radishes, I think it's somewhere right around 16 to 20 degrees, and both of those plants will be dead. So there's nothing living through the winter, and at times they will be tilled. And so we don't pretend that we capture every point that has a cover crop, but we do have a high percentage of cover crops that are planted that are cereal rye that are easier to pick up on. We also collect gully erosion information, and the way we view that is if it's a gully that we would walk up to the producer's door and suggest a practice for him, then it gets reported. And if it's less than that, it'll be taken care of probably through tillage or other means. And then gully erosion, there's a small asterisk by that too. Where our points are located, we collect the gully for the field that the point is in. So there's probably a little bit of statistical askew there, but we do it consistently. So it's the same fields every time we conduct the surveys. So here's just real quick, a little, if you've never learned about calculating surface soil erosion, here's the calculations that we basically go through. The revised universal soil loss equation is what we use. That's not the latest version, but it is the best version for us to use to make this all work by factors. So the more modern systems use practices and make assumptions about what the detail of the factors become. So we'll start here at 3 o'clock, the soil erodibility. So for our soils people in the group, every soil type is in a group that has a soil erodibility. And generally up here, our factors for drummer might be something like a 0.24. If we had a timber soil, that's something like a Dodge might be up to a 0.37. So that can have a big effect on how much soil is leaving or eroding away just based on the characteristics of the soil type. The slope factor, if you look in the picture to the right, you can see the hills there, and you have to sort of picture this. Those hills have a length to them where a drop of water hits the soil and starts to move with carrying soil particles until it starts to deposit particles. That length of travel is what we consider the length of the slope. And then the percent is just percent rise over run, basically. And they're combined to provide us with a factor. Flat ground has a really, really low factor, and big hills have really high factors. So if anything in here really plays a role in erosion, we all know that. It's the topography of the soils. P factor is pretty simple, cut and dried, and we oversimplify it, but it's either a 1 or it's a 0.5 in our system. These rows here are north-south or east-west. They're with the row. They don't wrap around the hill. And so they're just a factor of 1. They have no real effect, positive or negative. Terracing and contouring around the hill receives a P factor of 0.5. And so in a sense, cuts soil loss in half. The rainfall intensity is a given, a number provided again by NRCS. And as we go from the northern part to the southern part of the state, the rainfall factor increases. And so you're starting to get this idea. Southern Illinois is difficult. They have soils with higher soil erodibility. They have higher slopes generally, and the rainfall intensity is higher as well too. So they've got a lot of factors that make it more difficult to protect the soils there. So what we're looking at when we're driving, and we stop at this point, and in our system that points out here in the field 100 feet out, so we get past the headlands. And we're looking at what's the current crop, in this case, soybeans. And in fact, these are 15-inch soybeans. And so they get a little bit of a credit for being narrow road. The previous crop was corn. We can see corn rows that exist. So we know that it's no-till. And there's, in my guess anyway, there's probably at least 75% of the surface that's covered with residue. So by collecting that information, that's going to fulfill this calculation to provide us with what our soil loss will be. The other thing we're looking at, there's no evidence that there was a cover crop on this field, so that's a no. We drive around the bend, and unless there's a gully down through this draw, then it'll be a no as well there. So here we've got the watersheds. These are the results. Our last survey was 2018, and in 2018, it was a pretty typical normal year, and I'm just providing this by the watershed. So the state line and down, and then we have to also discount the urban areas. So we stay safe, we stay in the more agricultural portions of the watershed. So the western portion, or the central portion of McHenry and maybe a little bit of Kane County feeds into this. On this particular upper portion, there was 107 points, 71% were to tolerable soil losses, sustainable losses. 10% of that area was at 2T, and that's not, it could be highly erodible or approaching it. So our state average is about 79% to T, so you can tell that this area up in here, we have some erosion problems. When we look at corn, the tillage for corn and soybeans, 50% of corn is conventional tillage. That means there's basically no surface coverage. An additional small little piece, 2% is reduced, so it's not considered conservation tillage. And then we have 17% no-till for the corn acres. That's when corn is planted. That's a little bit above the state average by 2%. And mulch till is pretty good coverage. It's 30% of the surface or greater. So almost half of the upper Fox has some type of conservation, at least in 2018. For the soybeans, a better story. So soybeans are following corn. They have more residue to work with. Our no-till is up to 24%, which is less than the state average of 37%. So our no-till soybeans, for some reason, are a little lesser, but our reduced till, the mulch, or I should say the mulch till, is 63%. So here we have conservation on 87% of those acres. And then this is the sinners, the 13%. There's really probably not much reason not to have some conservation when you're planting soybeans. So those are some tough acres there probably. We'll go to the lower Fox and you realize, just look at all the green there on the T level. So the Fox, and again, it's because the lower Fox is very flat. These areas of LaSalle County and DeKalb County and Kendall and Kane, this portion in here is pretty flat. So it helps us get to T 94%. So from that standpoint, that portion of the watershed's in really pretty good shape when it comes to sheet and rill erosion. What's interesting is then on the tillage side of this. So if you combine the orange and the red here, we're over 80% that really don't need conservation tillage. So on our corn acres, we don't have that many acres that have conservation associated with it. With the soybeans, we're looking pretty good there. So the 39% no-till, slightly above the state average, and then the mulch till at 34. So these things don't always equate. So the northern portion has a little bit more no-till corn, but less no-till soybeans. And these are the kinds of things that, Jeff, we'd have a beer over and just try to figure out in our heads why it's that way. All right, I'm gonna fly through some of these real quick. This is just a trend line that's kind of negative. It's showing that if you discount these first three that we're using the old USLE formula, you realize that we're really trending down when it comes statewide to our acres protected to T. And 2006 was really our peak in terms of T and also no-till soybeans. We had over 50% of our beans in Illinois were no-tilled, and today in 2018 we're at 37%. All right, real quick on NLRS, I'm gonna just sort of fly through these real quick. So now we're in the unseen portion of those conservation cropping systems. We all know about the strategy and then the reports here. And in agriculture, here's our two boxes that are most important. What's interesting, in our state where it's flat, it's tile drain generally, and that's where we have nitrate problems. And then when we have rolling grounds like Southern Illinois, parts of Western Illinois, and probably parts of the Northern Fox there, phosphorus is our problem because it's leaving the field attached to soil particles. And so the practices we're talking about are still the important ones that are in play here. And cover crops, as you see, fit both. So cover crops, we calculate reduce soil erosion by 15 to 20%. So it's not a bad soil conservation practice, but it's a really great one for removing nitrates or holding nitrates for the future crop. And then we also do have the other edge of field practices, but they're expensive, and that's something that producers are probably, for some producers, might be a harder sell than even our agronomical practices. All right, real quick, I'm gonna fly through our couple of programs here. The Partners for Conservation program, cost share through the soil and water districts again. And here's the benefits. I think everyone that's heard a little something about cover crops understand the benefits, and there's probably 3 times this many in here. We provide through the district 75% cost share for seed and seeding. This is a program to help encourage producers to try cover crops, and we're able to extend that for 3 years to help them actually over a couple of bumps that they might have so that they can eventually work that into their system. And so that's where the real focus is. It's not to make anybody rich, it's just to help a little bit with that, with the idea of trying to incorporate that into your farming system. This year, all of our Partners for Conservation cost share programs, including the structures and terraces and waterways and things, all of those for our FY20 year are going to now include participation in the STAR program. The STAR program's run by Champaign County, and it's certainly, if you haven't had one, this would be a wonderful program to have at a meeting sometime. So it's a self-evaluation system on how you're farming as it relates to all the things that we're talking about here today. So it's a 5-star system, and as you add BMPs, your number of stars go up. And they have a recognition program through signage and PR work, but it's mostly for that producer to learn, what can I do by doing this and that, and earning more stars that relates back to how I'm doing and taking care of my land or enhancing my land. And at some point, I think this is going across Illinois, and many other states are starting to adopt this across the nation. And the hope is that someday that there'll be some incentive for your product, for your commodities, if you're farming sustainably at some star level within the program. So that's what the hope is somewhere down the line. Through our cost share program, we're hoping to pick up at least 500 new producers and fields as a part of combining those programs. There's just a couple of the worksheets. It's about 20 different areas that are evaluated, self-evaluation, to pull your score together. And this is all then collected through the Champaign's star program and through their district. Fall covers for spring savings and new one, again, partnership here with American Farmland Trust and others. It's for the federal crop insurance premiums that farmers pay for their crop protection. We are able to provide a $5 premium through USDA for farmers that have cover crops. And so last year was the pilot year. We've returned with the same funding this year, enough to enroll 50,000 acres, and that sign up begins December 15th. Again, the hope is that this will become commonplace. In other words, the idea is cover crops are a good insurance risk. They're going to level out high risk years of drought and rain, and help to level that out in terms of making that valuable in an insurance program type situation. So small incentive to try to work this into something much bigger in the future. And then my last slide here is every year for about, well, gosh, our old soil conservation seminars are probably 40 years old or so, but about 12 years ago, we began with our conservation cropping seminars. And so our 2021 series, like all the ones you mentioned, Jeff, will be virtual this year, free to the public. Anyone can register. Again, this is, oops, sorry. Oh boy. Through the Champaign County Soil and Water District. A couple of some really great speakers here. Ray Archuleta, and Ray, you might have seen him on the Netflix documentary here. He was kind of the expert guru. And if you haven't seen that, be sure to watch that. Dr. Joel Groover is organic and sustainable professor from Western that does a lot of work and has worked with a lot of Illinois farmers. And then Nick Jelensky from University of Minnesota. So it's 3 programs, 2 hours long. They're free. And then each one of these will be teamed up with 1, 2, or 3 farmers that are sort of practicing what these folks are going to be preaching. So Jeff, I think I better end there.
All right, thanks, Joe. Any questions? Type them into chat, and maybe, all right, Joe stopped sharing his screen, so we'll let Brad take over the screen sharing. And if you have any questions, type those in, and we'll see if we can get those addressed. We'll also have some time at the end, after all 3 have gone, to entertain any questions that you may think of.
There we go. I had to unmute myself. All right, I'm ready to go if we're all set.
All right, I think we're all set. I don't see any questions yet, so we'll carry on.
Very good. So yeah, my name is Brad Woodson with McHenry County Conservation District, and I think most of you are familiar with the conservation districts and the forest preserves. So you might ask though, how did we get involved in the farming business? And that's what I'm going to try to explain. So how we got here, and then talk about some of the things that we're doing. They go right along with what Joe was talking about. And then we've actually gone out and sampled some of our fields from a conservation standpoint. So we normally go out and we do Swink and Wilhelm and all these other natural areas inventory work on our natural areas, but we had to kind of come up with our own version of sampling farmland. So I'll talk about that a little bit and where we're headed. So the reason we got in the farming business is we passed 2 referendums in the early 2000s, and we bought a lot of land. So, and we just simply could not restore it quick enough. But that is our mission, is to restore natural areas, restore prairies, wetlands, and woodlands. But you'll see that, you know, we've accumulated quite a bit of land. So we have 26,000 acres throughout the county. And what's nice is our farmland has been adjacent. We bought it adjacent to expand the preserve size. So it goes right in with preserved, nature preserve design. and having that buffer. And so our existing farmland, it's a lot easier to manage, to burn, things like that next to a crop field rather than a subdivision. So it's nice to have that buffer now, and we will eventually restore much of that ground in the future. So where we stand today, and this number does change every year. So this coming up year, we're actually taking a little over 80 acres out of production. But right now we have 5,000 acres of row crop land, 320 acres of pasture. You can see the hay. The JGV is what we call joint grassland venture. So that is hay ground, but it's specifically for bird management. So it's a late cut. It's actually a July 15th cut of hay ground, and it's only one cutting per year. So it really does a nice job. And we've sampled that for grassland birds and had some tremendous success there. CRP is actually a federal program, that's Conservation Reserve Program. So that's a 10-year set-aside program. So those are kind of the categories where we're actually collecting money. But what we've also done is applied conservation practices to these fields, so to the row crop fields. So we have almost 300 acres of field borders, and that's basically a strip of permanent vegetation around each field. We have, in addition to that, 171 acres of filter strips. So those are along streams, and those are typically 66 feet. A field border is about 30 feet. And then we've installed waterways, and those are just areas that, what Joe would say, these are those gully areas that, that you need to correct. We've corrected them with permanent cover and grass waterways. So that's kind of where our farm acres break down. What's really neat about that, and we've made a conscious effort to move this way, is 24% of what we call our farm land is in permanent cover. And so, that's a good thing. So we're not getting any erosion. We're, deriving ecosystem benefits from those acres. And I should mention, the farmers are managing it. So that's a huge deal as well. So, and the other thing is they're paying for us, and that's like a win-win-win. So of course, we're getting money for the pasture land, the hay ground, and we've actually, and I have some slides on the pasture, I'll show you that, but it's really great to be able to have this land and get paid for it, and then also provide conservation on those acres. The field border, so again, that is that grass strip around each field. The farmer has the option to rent that back from us. They don't have to, but we do make them manage it. So if there's weeds, if there's brush, they have to mow it. If they want to use it for hay, then they pay us $30 per acre for that habitat. Okay, so, and it would be interesting to see where we're at today, but historically, we're actually getting a little bit better at soil erosion. So in the Corn Belt, it used to be 7.5 tons per acre. And this is kind of old data, 2007. Now it says 4.1 tons per acre. So that's a lot, and that's not good when you think about it. And so I actually came up with all these calculations just to say, what does that really mean? So I won't get into all that because Joe did talk about that. But here's kind of the take home. So if you think about, and 9 tons is about double where we're at today. So you could bring this back to 1/32, but 1/16 of an inch is 9 tons per acre. And I'm sure historically we had erosion at that rate. So if you think about it, 16 years go by and you've lost an inch. 32 years go by and you've lost 2 inches. And so, farming's been around for a long time. So the John Deere plow was invented, I had to write it down this morning, in 1837. So not all these acres have been farmed since 1837, but the disc was also developed in the 1800s. So some of this was pulled by horses and mules. Now they're pulled by, huge tractors. But the fact remains is we have lost, and we continue to lose soil every year. And you hear about, well, we've lost half our soil. That's a big problem. So you hear about the downfall of ancient civilizations. I mean, we cannot afford to lose any more soil. So that's where sustainable and regenerative agriculture comes in. And that's the direction that we're heading. So we've taken really the low-hanging fruit, and there is a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to agriculture. I just mentioned and I'll show you some pictures of field borders, filter strips. We do that. Simple crop rotation. So a simple crop rotation is corn and beans, and that's as simple as it gets. It'd be better to do more. No fall tillage. That's probably the easiest thing to do, and it's literally just asking the farmers, or in our case, telling the farmers, park your tractor, don't go into the field. And what's interesting is one of our hunters said this to us, and he said, the hunting was great, and then the farmer, dissed the field, and then all of a sudden the deer weren't going on to that area. And that was just one reason to remove, to not allow tillage. But having that soil surface covered is such a huge deal, and it's such an easy thing to do. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more, and I'm calling it limited grazing. There's rotational grazing, there's mob grazing, there's all this different types of grazing. But what we've done is we don't have grazing throughout the winter, and we've reduced the stocking rate that we allow, and it's really had some fantastic benefits. And of course, there's so much more, and Joe was right. If we could get more cover crops, we actually sent that information out to all of our farmers, and I know a few of them are taking advantage of it, this 3-year program with a 75% cost share. That's a huge deal because it is a risk. I mean, there's a cost associated with it, and there's more management that needs to go in to planting cover crops. So to make that transition as smooth as possible is great that the USDA is doing that. And then again, not just using rye, but using multiple species of cover crops, and that's definitely helpful. And really, it'd be nice to move to no-till. And I'm going to talk a little bit about more about no-till, but that's a hurdle. Honestly, with some of our farmers, it's definitely a hurdle to go to that point. And then back in the day, there used to be corn, beans, hay, or corn, beans, wheat. But we've gotten to this really simple rotation of corn and beans. But there's no question if we got to a little more diverse rotation, so you might have corn only once every 3 or 4 years and beans once every 3 or 4 years, and you'd put in other crops as well. That would be better. We're not there yet. So actually, I want to put this slide in here for 2 reasons. It is Veterans Day, so thank you for all our veterans that have serving. This is Glenn Von Bergen. He is our farm program manager. He's been there for quite a few years. He actually retired years ago, and we got him back on a part-time basis. So thank you for our veterans for serving. This is a newly established field border, and it's basically just a strip of permanent cover. But for somebody who is really interested in doing more, again, there's a pollinator program. You can do that on your own, or you can have the USDA's help with that. But planting diverse mix of flowers and native grasses in these field borders and filter strips is the way to go. So then it's just simple math. If we just go 30 feet around a 40-acre field, that's another 3.5 acres of habitat. If it's an 8-acre field, it's 5.5 acres of habitat. So we can put habitat on the landscape very easily. Iowa State has this prairie strips program where they go right through the middle of the field, and you hear about contour farming, putting these strips on contours. So the real opportunity is over 50% of the land in Illinois is owned by non-farmers. So if that landowner says, "Hey, I want to do more for conservation," they can do it, and write it into the lease, and the farmers will go along with it. But the only downfall is in some cases there is a cost associated with it, and you might you're going to be taking 3 acres out or 5 acres out of production. But a lot of landowners are more than willing to do that. Here's an example of a filter strip on the left. Was before we put them in, and the farmer was farming very close to the stream. We put in these nice big filter strips, and we actually, what was really neat about this is up near Chemung with Lawrence Creek and the Piscasaw. We actually saw the mussel community recover and get much better in that time period. So we actually just happened to do a fish and mussel survey, and I think it was 1988 or 1989. We did another one in 99 or 2000, and we saw a marked increase in mussels and freshwater mussels in the stream. And we attributed it to these filter strips. Here's just an example of a newly established grass waterway. You can see where the water would flow off that field and get caught in this little swale. So again, we want to have permanent cover wherever water could be running. And so again, just to echo what Joe said is, I've already seen that it's already mid-November. Some of these fields are turning brown because they're being disked, and it could be a 6 to 7 month period that these fields are bare. Last night, I know we got at least an inch of rain, and a hard inch of rain. So that will cause a lot of these fields to erode. If you have cover on that field, that prevents a lot of erosion. And this picture was actually taken June 1st, and that's after some of that material had already started to decompose. And actually, if you look really closely, there's soybeans growing up in there. So it's already been planted. It hasn't been disturbed. And this is what we really like to see. So I mentioned that we had developed our conservation index, and Olga's going to be coming up next. And we actually work with Olga and Delta Institute and the Liberty Prairie Foundation, and talking about our program. And they had some grant money, and they helped us and kind of pushed us along to help us, think about and develop this conservation index. So the ideal situation is for us to sit down with a farmer and say, hey, what's your yield and profitability? And then for us, historically, all we cared about, I hate to say it like that, but how much, who the farmer was, and then how much we were getting per acre. And then, who was speaking for the land. So what kind of measurements were we taking on the land? And we really weren't taking these. So that's what we're trying to correct now. So we're actually, even today, we have soil samples being taken by an independent company. And then we are taking our own, number 2, our own biological and ecological assessments. So with those 3 data sets, we can sit down and really have something. So we go out on really late May or early June, and we look at residual cover, and I'll explain what that is. We look at what green cover is. We measure the filter strip, and some of this is compliance, and some of it's just a measure. So yeah, the compliance is to make sure that the filter strip and the field border are adequate size. So there's many methods. You can use a rope. You can you can do an estimation method, but we just came up with a stick, put lines on it, and if there's a piece of dead material that's residual cover underneath one of those lines, we count it. So we throw that down 3 times. We get a 50 count multiplied times 2, and that's our percent cover. It's pretty straightforward. But you can see on the left is corn coming up through bean stubble, and on the right is beans coming up through corn stubble, and what a difference it makes. Okay, and so along with that, we also do what we call a field worm test, and we look at adjacent quality habitat, and we do this soil compaction measurement. So when we first did the soil compaction measurement, we used a penetrometer. We went out there and we did 1 sample, and then immediately, again, when you're out doing this work, you say, well, we need to do more. So we started taking measurements from basically 1 inch to 6 inches, and then 6 to 12, and then deeper measurement beyond 12, because sometimes you couldn't even get the penetrometer in the ground. Other times it would slide in, it would hit a hard layer. So again, what we want to be able to do is come back to the farmer and say, yeah, this is what we're seeing, and not just have them go out and vertically till, or not vertically till, but chisel it or whatever. So we're taking these measurements out in the field, and we want to go back to the farmers and talk with them about it. So the shovel probe test is very straightforward. We basically take about a quart of soil, spread it out in a pan, pick it apart, and count the worms in there. So there's way more high-tech ways to do that, but for somebody who's not versed in all the different insects and all the soil biota, this was something that both Glenn and I could do, and that's what we did. Here's an example of a penetrometer. We have 2 of them, so Glenn goes out, I go out, and basically you just push this thing in the ground, and you can see it goes, the red part is 300. We had some fields that, I hate to say this, but several fields that we could not penetrate the ground. So that's a real problem. The farmers know that, but it needs to be solved, and there are different ways to solve it. So we'll go out and take a couple different samples. It's super quick and easy to do, and we'll just take an average and make sure we get a good reading. And so really our goal is to look at this soil health and health on these fields and see if this sustainability is equal to profitability. So if we can sit down with a farmer and say, yeah, you're doing a great job, we're seeing this, and he's saying, yeah, since I implemented these practices, I might be doing less tillage, but I might be getting I have to apply less nutrients, or it could be a lot of different things. But profitability is more important than just yield. And I think, unfortunately, it's always about yield. So the yield keeps going up. So the farmers think, oh yeah, everything's fine. But if they're applying more fertilizer, then that's being offset by that profitability. And what we're really interested in too is seeing what other ecosystem services these ag fields can provide. And one of them is water infiltration. We have suffered, and this is great, for the Fox River watershed is massive amounts of flooding. Well, imagine if 5,000 acres or 30,000 acres or whatever, however many thousand acres could absorb that water, hold that water instead of run it off. So that's what we're looking at is, can we, through cropping systems and through doing some different practices, absorb more of that water, infiltrate more of that water instead of having it run off. So that's one of them. And then we actually put in a bioreactor this year. We want to sample that water. And are there things with nutrient management that we can do and work with our farmer to have less surface runoff and drain tile runoff that's high in nutrients? And then also, what are these practices doing for wildlife? Whether it's insects, whether it's fish in these streams, or whether it's it could be birds, it could be a lot of different things, but we want to look at those areas as well. So tillage, I mean, this is a picture I took this year. I mean, when the ground is wet, it gets tilled, it just becomes rock hard. It's not good. Here's an area, this is down in what we call the Coon Creek area. And unfortunately, the part of the field flooded. So the farmer just recently disked it. So I did 3 shovel probes for worm. I'm sorry, I did a shovel probe for worm, and I got 3 worms on the area that was not tilled and none after 3 probes on the recently tilled one. And this is what is interesting about the penetrometer. It was on the area that was not recently tilled. It was 125, 175, 200. It slid in easily. And the other one was just a little more compact. But then both of them did not have, good residual cover. I mean, they were basically no residual cover. So in probably May 25th or 26th, we got a 5-inch rain. This happens to be near our Coral Wood site. And again, if you look closely, you can see the corn that's in rows coming from kind of right to left. But this was bean stubble, wasn't tilled, but just the fact that bean stubble does not provide a lot of residual cover, we had a lot of erosion. I mean, it's pretty darn obvious. There was no worms in this field, pretty compact, 225, 275, and then 150. It actually got a little less compact the deeper you went down. But the residual cover, I didn't go in this area that had just eroded. I went in the other, part of the bean field, had 24% residual cover, which is probably okay for a bean field, but not enough for a 5-inch rain. So the solution to this is cover crops. Cover crops would have really helped this situation. Again, we have compacted soil all over, and when you have bare soil and basically the rain hits it, it moves those particles and it just sorts and fills in. So that's the rain part of it. But then when it's driven over countless times with tractors, and there's really not a lot of roots in there because a lot of these rows are in 30-inch rows. So there's nothing to support that weight. The soil becomes compact. And then the farmer wants to chisel it or till it to try to loosen it up. So it's kind of this cycle that is not going anywhere. It's not getting better. Here's an area, this was either ridge tilled or just a light disking, but this is better. So this was corn, and you can see how it looks great. There's some cover on the surface. The beans are coming up just fine. So this is better than all out disking and turning the whole thing brown. Okay, again, here's that no-till field. So what will happen here is it'll be planted, and then basically a herbicide treatment, like with a Roundup, and these are probably Roundup ready beans, and it'll kill the weeds. The beans will come up, and that soil is protected. This same area received that 4 to 5 inches of rain, and you can see those bare spots that didn't have cover on it. It did wash a little bit. So anything that was exposed with those heavy rains does get take a beating from the rain. But what was nice about this no-till field is the penetrometer just shoved in there nicely. It was very soft, not compact at all. 3 worms in the shovel probe, and then again 94% residual cover. It was fantastic, and that's what we want to see. This happens to be our board president's field, so he should be proud of that. It's great to see that. This again is in the Coral Woods area. We have several fields along there. It's cover crop, and 4 worms in the first shovel probe, and again the penetrometer just slid right in. Fantastic. And in this case, we had a lot of, it looks like a lot more than 58% green cover, but when you're standing down, looking right over it, and then when you're counting the lines, that's what it came up to be. I will not go into too much of the soil survey because I think Olga's going to talk a little bit more about that. But it's something that we used to have the farmers do, but we wanted to take control of that data. We collect it, and then we're going to provide it to our farmers. We did it last year. We're doing it this year. So we will email this data right to our farmers. But you can see how quickly these data sets would just grow and grow and grow. There's a lot to look at. You can't just look at one thing like organic matter. You have to look at a lot of different things. So that we're just kind of scratching the surface on soil surveys. The interesting thing, though, we're doing the standard soil survey. We're also doing a biological survey. So in this case, we're using Haney, but there's Solveta, there's the Cornell, but we're sticking with Haney for right now. And I put this on here because it is frustrating, because you see, well, how can you get 9.9% organic matter from one test and you get 4% on the other? And I listened to Gabe Brown, and he, so, and he's up in the 9%, 9% range. So it can be done, but it's not, we have to be talking apples to apples and the same type of soil tests, because they are not all done exactly the same. But this area happened to be fantastic soil. This is at Pleasant Valley, and it was one of our pastures. And you just pull the soil apart, is just great aggregation. 7 worms in it. The probe slid from each all the way down 100 psi, as easy as it gets. So this is the ideal situation right here. So really, how do we treat our soil? And really, unfortunately, conventional agriculture, it's soil loss. We're losing a certain amount of soil every year. And these are kind of my working definitions. They're so simple, but I think that's the way to go. Sustainable is you're not losing any soil. So there's a certain amount of soil that is made if you just use crop rotation, but it's very small. So again, you're not losing that 32nd. You're not using that 64th of an inch. You're just net staying where you're at. But I think where we need to go, when we look at about carbon and carbon credits and building organic matter, we need to think about building soil. And there is ways to do it. And farmers and researchers have shown that there's ways to do it. And so it's not easy, but that's where we need to be heading. So we put in these field borders and filter strips in about 10 years ago. So it's just a great side-by-side way to look at what's going on in the field. And then it's kind of a control that's right there. So at Pleasant Valley, I went out and sampled it, 300 psi. You couldn't even stick the probe in the ground. Then you go to the field border, which oftentimes does get driven on by the farmers, but it still had way less compaction. And then 6 worms in the field border and none. So I mean, it's pretty telling when you see that. Then go down to Winding Creek, very similar. And unfortunately, I'll blame this on Glenn that he didn't do the worm sample, but it was probably me. Who knows? But again, these are missed opportunities. I wish we would have done it, but when you see this evidence right there, and again, we're just building this data right as we speak. This is only the 2nd year we've gone out in the field and taken these measurements. This one happened to be at Lawrence Creek. It was an area that was prevent plant 2 years in a row, but there was all these nice weeds. So I dug it up, and you can just see the weeds, and that would be the same thing as a cover crop, or same thing as rye or oats, just penetrating that soil and helping build that soil back. So weeds are a good thing, and roots are a good thing, not necessarily weeds. But that's where that rotation comes in. If you can do that, that is going to help the soil. So the problem really that I see it, and I actually spent some time with a farmer yesterday, is they are convinced that they need to do some type of tillage, and all the research says no, tillage is bad. But then there's this question between perception and reality: is what do they need? How can they still make a profit? How can they work the soil? How can they plant? Not all the farmers have no-till equipment. They don't have all the tools, and this is really expensive equipment to have, to be able to mulch the soil and not disc it. So a vertical till piece of equipment. That's where we have to go, and this is going to take sitting down with each farmer and trying to figure out how we plot a course to get to sustainable and regenerative agriculture. So I want to talk just briefly about grazing. Again, our limited grazing is low stocking rate. We do rotate, and then we don't allow this wintering. And if you look at animal units, we're about 1 animal unit per 3 acres. And these pictures were taken in September 11th. And so what was neat about this year, the farmer had some sheep and some cows on the pasture. So if you livestock always makes things interesting. So they're they run around, and they're going to eat certain things at certain times. They're going to not eat certain things. So it adds a lot of diversity to these pastures. So on the right side of this fence was the area, and they did not graze it hard. We had really good, adequate moisture. The cattle were just sitting out there fat and happy. There's plenty of vegetation in this pasture. The neat thing, and I know they're doing this with bison at Nachusa, they're looking at, hey, what are the impacts of grazing on woody vegetation? And there's no question they impact the woody vegetation. So they browse through it. They browse a little bit on it. They trample it. So it does have an impact, which is fantastic. And they also create some kind of diversity. So again, not all of it looks like this, but they will pound some areas down and have some wallow areas. Look at the willow thicket behind, in the background. So they create that diversity, and then things that thrive on that diversity, or I'm sorry, that disturbance will come up the next year. So I think this is a good thing. Pastures on the right, and then an area that hasn't been burned enough is on the left, and you can see the difference. So this is actually a lot of that pasture was cool season pasture was always existing. We actually had a restored area, and then we fenced it in a couple of years ago, and we allowed it to be grazed, and just the same grazing system. The cows can move about, and they are locked in one pasture and move the other. But this is one of the pastures, and there's dropseed, there's blazing star, there's all sorts of stuff. And so I thought, nobody's going to believe me. I saw these great pictures, so I took a picture of a cow patty right in there that, hey, this was grazed, and it's actively grazed, and it still looks fantastic. So that's good. And there's something about manure when it comes to insects, when it comes to birds, and even mushrooms. So that's part of that, and it helps build the soil. There's packed nutrients. So there's a lot to manure, but I only took a couple manure shots. So one thing that we did at the district years ago is we took out big blue stem Indian grass, switchgrass out of our tall grass prairie mixture of our prairie mix, because it grows so tall and so rank that grassland birds weren't using it. And again, what happens is we plant it, and then we burn it, and it just gets more and more, and it outcompetes all the other prairie plants out there. But again, and there's something called patch burn graze, which is being practiced, and cows can tip that balance. So they can graze, and this is just all cows grazing, graze those tall grasses, trample that vegetation down, create space for forbs to come in. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what this looks like next year. And again, here's another couple more shots. And so I happened to be out in Utah this year. And again, grazing gets a bad name. And when I looked at some of this stuff, I'm like, wow, what are they doing out there? It's amazing. And again, this is federal land. We hear all about it. But grazing can be done wrong. This is about 5 years ago on this same pasture. And if you put too many cows on a pasture, this is what you're going to get. So we don't want to go there. We don't want to go back there. But grazing done right can be absolutely fabulous. So this fabulous shot, there's about 4 or 5 bobolinks just flying around. And again, this is one of our pastures, and it just can be really good bird habitat. So what I like about it is farmers managing it. We're getting all these great benefits. We're getting paid for it. And, managing 320 acres takes time if it was one of our staff doing it, but we're having cows, and in this case, cows and sheep, manage this property for us. And we're, of course, working with the farmer to do that. Just want to talk, again, when we look at grassland management, our tools, fire is obviously one we're burning right now, and I'm 100% on board for burning, but burning is not going to take care of all of our grasslands, all of our wetlands, all of our woodlands. it's a great tool, but it can't be done everywhere, and it's not as effective at controlling brush. And the other thing too is, and if you do fall burns, then you're going to have that cover sitting, it's going to be pretty much devoid of cover throughout much of the winter. In spring burn, it greens up right away. So just looking at grazing versus burning, I mean, again, we should be using every possible tool that we can to manage our habitat. I'm going to talk briefly about our grassland venture. So typically that's just done on what we purchased. When I showed all that land we purchased, some of these areas were cool season meadows, our former hay fields, and we're just continuing to graze them to hay them to keep them open, but it's a late season cut. So it's past July 15th or, July 15th or later. And that allows birds to nest successfully, and it still keeps these areas from getting filled in with brush and weeds. This is just one of those areas, they grow back. And so that is different than standard alfalfa. So unfortunately, like a regular hay field would get cut 3 times, sometimes even 4 times a year, sometimes every 30 days. So that's not enough time for grassland birds to complete their life cycle, their nesting life cycle. So we're, steering away from that. We do have just a few fields. If we have a really highly erodible field, alfalfa or hay is better than row crops. But this is what would be considered a biological trap for some grassland birds. They'd come in here and nest, and then they would not be able to successfully nest. So we have some great prairie restorations. We're staying away from those with our ag program. I mean, someday if you could fence it, if you had water there, you could lightly graze it. But for right now, we're just burning those areas and spot treating those areas. So one thing that we have done, and we've done this on a few fields, is we'll even if it's a kind of a low diversity restored prairie, we would actually go in and hay it and then interseed it and do that for a couple of years, and then we're actually getting that diversity back. So again, instead of, we call it mechanical grazing. So we're just taking that material off, taking that competition off, and you can see bare spots, opportunity areas for other seeds to come in. So we have done that, trying to enrich some of these prairie restorations. Finally, this is my last slide. So, at the district, we talk about water, wildlife, and way of life. And I think everybody, and especially this year with COVID, we've seen so much use of our sites. It's been amazing. So people walking the trails. But agriculture, and again, what's neat about McHenry County and the whole watershed, Fox watershed, is we have rural areas. You don't have to go too far out in Marengo and Harvard and Chemung, Hebron, and we have very rural areas. Now, this picture was taken actually out on our farm in Southwest Iowa, but these areas, they're working landscapes, they provide income, but also what's nice is the USDA has stepped up and said, hey, if you're going to have CRP, you have to do a diverse planting, or you have to do a pollinator plot. They're encouraging farmers to have filter strips. So if the farmers work with USDA and our farmers, they work with us, we can actually achieve some really fantastic benefits and manage natural areas, have wildlife, water infiltration, all those things on our agricultural land. So that's all I have. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hey, Brad, this is Steve Zimmerman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I got a question on one of I think your slide just before this, the interseeding. Do you drill seed the forbs, or what do you guys do?
No, we actually got away from drilling. We use a broadcast seeding. So we typically do a dormant season seeding on everything. So whether it's a new field, and I should mention that. So if we actually have an ag field that we're going to restore, we ask our farmers not to put any pre-emergent herbicide on that year, because we've had some terrible failures because that stuff is residual at last. So we'll just broadcast it on, spread it on when there's a little bit of snow on the ground, let the snow work it in the soil. Same thing with existing vegetation. Like Tom Vanderpool actually talked about this. I think he wrote some article about it, that these mowed areas, and then you seed into them, and all of a sudden you stop mowing and they come up diverse. So we've practiced that and done that, and it's worked out well.
Thanks, Brad. Can I ask a second quick question? You had an image, I think it was cover crop from the top down, where you showed it was like only 50% or something. in the middle of your presentation. What do you think is like a successful cover crop coverage? And the reason I ask is in Lake County, when we do prairie seedings and we have to get permits and they require 90% cover by cover crop. And I've tried to explain to them that that's not even feasible and not good when you're trying to plant prairie and you want the little seedlings to get sunlight.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a great, you know what, and you know, if you looked at that horizontally, it'd be 90%, but if you look at it, you know, vertically, it's not. So that's asking a lot. I know I would say that's too much. I don't know how you convince them of that, besides taking them out there and explaining, you know, what you're trying to do. But yeah, I don't think you'd want anywhere near 90%. And then that's the whole point of going in and mowing a newly established prairie a couple times a year, is you need to knock that competition back, whether it's a cover crop or weeds, to get some sunlight in there. So that would I would think you'd want to spend some time and explain that to them.
Yeah, I joined their TAC committee a few months ago, and I'm going to bring that up. But yeah, they basically said they wouldn't let us off the hook till we reach 90% cover. And I said, we're not going to reach it because we're going to mow it off this week.
Right.
It's never going to get above 50. But anyway.
Right.
All right, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Steve, for some good questions. There were a couple others submitted through the chat box, but in the interest of time, I want to get Olga going on her part of the presentation. We're running a little bit late here, but I think some really good information being shared, so hopefully folks can stay around. I will note that the presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the FREP webpage. I put a link in the chat box to the Delta Institute website where the information Olga will be presenting can be found. And we may figure out a way to also address questions that we don't have time to get to today through our webpage or through email at a later time. So go ahead, Olga.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Just a quick sound check.
Yep, I can hear you well.
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me. And I thought, you know, we could close out by talking a little bit about some of the tools and supporting kind of frameworks that Delta Institute has worked on developing that can help transition to regenerative agriculture. The two main things that I will cover is sort of conservation leasing and soil testing. All of these came out from the work that we've been doing that is motivated by the nutrient loss reduction strategy that Joe had mentioned, and the idea that we need to find ways to incentivize adoption of conservation practices through different means, you know, cost share programs and technical support and all these other things that have already been mentioned are important, but we sort of need all the tools in the toolbox that we can use. And in particular, land tenure is an important factor in Illinois because over 60% of land is not operated by people who own the land. And so when landowners and farmers kind of come together and articulate kind of how the land is managed, the lease can be a really important tool in driving how, you know, what that looks like. And so we actually focused on public land, McHenry County Conservation District, as well as other forest preserve districts in the collar counties around Chicago, and Department of Natural Resources collectively own and manage about 75,000 acres of farmland across the state. And so we thought this would be a really good kind of way to frame out what those conservation leases could look like so that farmers who rent land from public agencies can follow those structures and you know, implement conservation practices, and then over time hopefully start to implement them on other land that they manage. And so Jeff had posted the link to our webpage that has, you know, the full report that goes into detail on what a conservation lease could look like. And here's just a really quick demo that that's from that report. And basically, you know, there's a number of different provisions that you can apply to your lease if you have, you know, a landowner and a farmer and you want the lease to capture kind of how that land is managed. And they range from, you know, identifying existing constraints, setting the terms. So we, you know, longer terms encourage kind of investment into conservation practices, because some of them take a few years to kind of show the benefits of soil health and so on. You can, you know, explicitly require different conservation provisions in the lease. You can set the rate so that it, you know, allows for adjustments and discounts potentially when conservation is implemented. You can include reporting requirements, and that helps with transparency, but also kind of evaluation and tracking of what is happening, so that you could, you know, you could see when things are, you know, implemented, and, you know, conduct associated soil testing, as Brad had talked about, to show that, you know, in response to management, things are changing in the soil. And then you can have various kind of, you know, you need to check for provisions that are common in a lot of leases that may provide kind of disincentives inadvertently without realizing it. So the report on our website kind of goes through each one of these pieces and kind of describes the pros, the cons, you know, various considerations that you can take into account. And we also worked with the Vermont Law School clinic to develop sort of template provisions for the leases. So if you wanted to include some or all of provisions related to these categories, you can also find those on our website. And, you know, those are the ones that on the slides show up in the blue boxes. So again, this is the website where you can find a lot of this information. And then actually for soil testing, I'm going to take us directly to that website so I can show you. You know, Brad talked about kind of the complexities of different soil testing and how you choose where you test and what you test for, and what parameters you evaluate, how frequently, and all that stuff. And so we had actually worked with Brad and his team to collect some samples last fall. While they were doing the Haney test, we also sent them to a few other labs. And then we are currently doing some soil testing with Lake County, Kane County, and Will County Forest Preserve districts on their fields as well. But based on our experience with McHenry County, we put together this soil health testing guide. So this is sort of the quick guide version, which is on our website. And there is a more kind of detailed version of that as well, that walks landowners and, you know, partners that they're working with through a process to figure out how to, you know, set up a soil testing protocol to be able to evaluate the, you know, this transition to regenerative agriculture and management, and, you know, show that, you know, you have soil organic matter potentially that's increasing, or compaction is changing, or, you know, other things. And so I'm going to quickly scan through this quick guide just to give you an idea of what's in it. Basically, you know, what all you need to do in order to prepare for soil testing, you know, set goals, decide on sites that you're going to test, choose a lab, you know, when are you going to do it, what already you know about the land that you're testing, get all the supplies ready. You know, there are lots of resources about different kinds of tests that you can do. And here I should say, we're talking about not just the NPK testing, the chemical testing that is traditionally done a lot, but also the, you know, biological and physical parameters that together kind of describe health of the soil. And so we've done this with McHenry County properties, where we looked at the cropping history, pulled in a lot of information that we can, you know, that's publicly available to sort of better understand how that land has been managed in the past so that we can interpret the data that we get from the lab better. Soil types, sort of historical characteristics of the weather, in pre-settlement and, in the 30s and the 50s, what kind of land use was on this parcel. And then once you have all that, you're ready to go out, collect some soil samples, send them to the lab. So we, typically there's grid testing that's done to, to understand kind of what fertilizer rates you need to apply. What we have done with this approach is actually get a composite test for each field. So that only requires, 4 to 6 samples per field, and you combine them all together, mix it up, and that's your sort of representative sample for each field. Send that to the lab, and once you get the results, you can start looking to see what they mean. So this is actually an example from McHenry County data, where we looked at different fields under different management conditions, and this plot shows you the soil health index. So what they do is they measure 12 different parameters and then combine it into sort of this overall soil health index, which could be a really useful way just at a glance to see kind of, what the state of your field is. And so you could see that the grazing fields actually, have a much higher soil health index than some of the cropland fields. And I think it's, it's related to a lot of what Brad had talked about in terms of there's cover, there are roots in the soil, there's sort of more biological kind of activity happening on those fields than you have on sort of your regular soy bean fields. And then some labs, in particular, the Cornell Soil Health Lab does a really nice job of providing, together with the report of the results, sort of a lot of recommendations about what can be done to improve various parameters, kind of deconstructing it from this, provide this overall soil health index, but of course also give you the measurements for all the individual parameters as well. And if one in particular is the one that needs improvement, their report kind of offers suggestions on what can be done to change that. And then, once you have that baseline established, you can come back to the same field every couple of years, more frequently if you have resources and capacity to do that, and, measure particular things that change quicker, and, go from there to start kind of evaluating what is changing in response to management as you kind of proceed in that transition to regenerative agriculture. And again, one really quick thing that I wanted to mention is that in addition to these kind of 2 things, conservation leasing framework and templates and a soil testing guide, we have a number of additional resources available on our website. We have a fact sheet about regenerative agriculture that just, is helpful to have everybody kind of be on the same page about what it means and what the, what you're talking about when you're talking about regenerative agriculture. We've developed a set of regenerative agriculture principles that I think we were working with the public landowners to formulate and adopt. So if an agency like the Conservation District or a Forest Reserve District owns farmland, they could use these principles as sort of a guide, to decide how they're going to manage it. And we hope to kind of take it to Chicago wilderness community to kind of make this something that becomes a regional thing potentially. The Agriculture Conservation Index that Brad had mentioned, it's basically sort of a system that allows you to evaluate and track progress. We developed it together with McHenry County Conservation District and Liberty Prairie Foundation, but I think it could be a useful tool that can be tweaked and adapted to fit the needs of whatever landowner. is trying to measure for their land. And then we've also had a project in parallel, kind of working with Conservation Land Trust, who also own farmland. So it's not public land, but it's sort of an institutional landowner as well that is trying to conserve land and make sure that the farmland that they have is managed sort of in accordance with their mission. And so we've developed a working lands program guide as well that, for an organization that might be interested in, doing what McHenry County Conservation District is doing, and create sort of a programmatic infrastructure around it. This guide can help people think through that and figure out how to do that. What are the pieces that need to be in place to do that? So I kind of flew through that presentation. I hope you guys check out our project page and all the resources that I had mentioned online, and feel free to be happy to answer any questions now or through email in the future if any come up.
All right.
So
thanks,
with that,
Olga,
I
and,
will.
Yeah, sorry for giving you the short shrift there at the end of it. There were a couple of questions that came up that we'll take a moment here to answer. The first one, I don't know, I guess any of you could really answer this. Cover crops obviously help with erosion. How well do they help with rainwater infiltration and keeping the soils moist?
I'll take a shot at just cereal rye. It's kind of an interesting thing with cereal rye because it grows so quickly in the spring. So once it, we still have some farmers, I think, that are probably still drilling it right now. So it's going in over the winter. There won't be hardly any growth over the winter. It should germinate. And then somewhere in March, it's going to start to take off. And so a lot of our folks that planted in front of soybeans, they have a decision. They're either going to kill it before it's 12 inches tall, or they're going to let it go to the boot stage like 6 feet tall, 5 to 6 feet tall. And this moisture thing is really interesting because it's pulling a lot of moisture out of the ground. So it depends on the timing and then the season and the year, in that it's able to dry soils out to make it able to farm that. On the other hand, if you happen to turn into a really dry May and it had pulled too much moisture out, you're going to have a bit of a deficit for your crop going in. And so I think there's a little bit of art to that. And then you're a little bit at the, you're of course with everything, you're at nature's, you have to just deal with whatever the rain comes. And that's why so many people that do cover crops early, or when they first start, they really want to kill it at 12 inches or less. So they're just done with that and they don't have to deal with that decision on the moisture of the soil. Plays both ways, but the benefits from the tall, the deeper roots, a lot of soil infiltration. So once it's up and growing, and that's, those are our big months for precipitation, is April through August, basically. And that's the time that most of our erosion occurs. And so having that really actively growing in April and then still having all of that structure still there, even in May and June, it's really a huge benefit. And annual ryegrass even more so. They talk so much about that, having root systems that go 4 feet deep. And so both fantastic, of course, for holding on to nitrogen, but infiltration has to be tremendous. I don't know that I've seen a lot of studies. I'm sure there are, but I would think that they would start to be similar to some of our native plantings.
So a more complicated answer than you might have expected, but thanks, Joe. The next question is for Brad. Has MCCD looked at carbon sequestration markets and the opportunity this might provide in converting cropland to the more permanent prairie restorations?
Yeah, we have. And actually, we have a couple times, and our board had just recently asked us again. And, the problem is they typically want you to commit to like a 15-year time period. And I think we were looking at indigo ag. In this case, the farmer would get all the benefits. They would get the payment, which is fine. You could always adjust the rent that way. But there's still quite a few unknowns. So and as far as how much you would get, so I don't know, and that's really not a well-developed market. So there's still some hesitancy. We're not doing it yet, but we have certainly researched it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Brad. And the last question that I see here, what is the downside for farmers to do no-till? Is the obstacle tradition or something more practical? Which is kind of a good broad question that I know have been wrestled with for many years, and you probably all have answers for that.
That's probably going on 50 years that people have wrestled with this. I think one of the big ones is, generally speaking, you know, our planting season, we try to push that early and earlier. It seems like all the time. So as soon as the soil's fit and you can get a tractor across it, seems like planters for big farmers are starting to roll. So temperature and moisture. So cooler soils, damper soils can create probably the most risk early on. But the really good no-tillers, and I'm going to say Brad's going to say the same thing, is they have some patience and they wait for those right days, and they're going to more than compensate from that. But
yeah, of course, I'd agree with all that. And the only thing is and Joe would probably be the guy to answer this, but you know, like I went with a farmer yesterday and he was showing me an inline ripper, and a lot of farmers can or think they can solve some compaction problem, especially deep compaction, with an inline ripper. Now, somebody else would say, well, you can do that with tillage radishes or, you know, cover crops. But then again, it's that patience thing. So there is conflicting data, and I think a lot of farmers, they're seeing, I get better yield, I can bury this trash, you know, they call it trash, the residue, with some type of tillage. So that I think it's a huge hurdle. But the farmers that are going down the road and using no-till, and where our farms at in Southwest Iowa, they've been doing it for 30 years, literally. It's taken some time, and when it's on flatter ground or heavier soils, it's not a common practice. So we got to get over that hump, but it does seem like the way to go. But the farmers have to see a benefit in order to make it happen.
Right. Let's see, one last question. Is there any data on soil quality for grazed prairies? Which I think Olga basically kind of showed a little bit from the work she did with you guys, Brad.
Yeah, and Olga, please jump in. The one thing, and it was really unfortunate, and we just happened to pick this field, but the restored prairie that was picked was literally a 1 or 2 year old restored prairie. So it was not a really well established. So it was in crops 3 years prior to that, let's say. So I think that the jury's still out, and we're going to do some reference samples this year, and we're going to use a remnant prairie. We're going to use about a 20-year-old restored prairie. So we're going to try to get some better sampling of those types of habitats. So we'll have better data in the future.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I will just add that we've been working with the different county forest reserves and deciding on where to sample. We've picked agricultural fields, hay fields, as well as prairies and a few other kind of natural area sites, so that we could compare sort of what the potential in the upper bound in soil organic matter could be in those types of soils. And so it'll be very interesting to see. But I think, you know, there may be other studies outside of, you know, what we've been doing here so far that point to that. And I think more to come, because soil health testing, you know, the biology and all those parameters, that's such a kind of active emerging field right now that
Yeah, right.
more and more people will be gathering data and doing research on it.
So, and I will just say, you may be hearing from us towards a presentation on a little bit more of that type of information at the Fox River Summit. I know we had some things a couple years ago up there, and we're interested in keeping that topic front and center as part of the summit. So thank you very much to Joe, Brad, and Olga for your presentations. Most people hung in and stayed the duration, so I think that meant it was of great interest. We will post a recording of it to the FREP webpage as soon as I get the video processed and all of that. And look forward to seeing you all again. Get outside and enjoy the sunny weather. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.